All right. So I
Let's
guess
do Kedusha.
exactly. We're 5 minutes in. We're going to get to Richard McPhee's favorite topic because Richard McPhee sent me an email about this earlier this year. A halachic question. Yeah, okay. I see you visually remembering. It's good. So, to review, last week we started the first bracha of Shema after 2 weeks ago covering Baruch Hu. So now we're in the thick of things. We're in the heart of Shema. And what we covered last week was everything up until the Kedusha in the first bracha in Yotzer Or. And our framing, just to remind everybody for how to think about this, came from one of my rabbis, Rav Ezra Bick. He's a rabbi in the Gush who writes a lot about Tefillah. He has a book on the Yoke Midot, a book on Shemona Esrei, and then he has a series of online articles about the rest of the Siddur. And Rav Bick has a very powerful point in framing the brachot, where he points out that the Shema itself, clearly across rabbinic literature, across halachic literature, the Shema has the goal of Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim, of accepting the yoke of the heavenly kingdom, God, accepting God as king.
A little bit more.
Given that, just a reminder to everybody to mute yourself unless you're asking a question or participating. But given that framing, that we're dealing with accepting God's kingship, Rav Bick said we should view these brachot, we should view the introductory blessings as being testaments, as being statements of God as king. So there's two elements to God as king. The first element is the God as God of the nature, king of nature, the physical rulership that God has over everything, by virtue of being its creator, by being its steward, etc., etc. And then the second element, which we'll get to in the second bracha, is God, the creator, steward, and ruler, or progenitor of Torah, a spirituality of the metaphysical spiritual realm. So we cover these two elements of the God's kingliness, kingship, in the two introductory brachot, and that should then culminate in a natural recognition of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. One, both the kingship of God, that God is our God, but two, also Hashem Echad, that the same entity that creates and has stewardship over nature is the entity that authored and created Torah and spiritual meaning, etc., etc. So that is our goal of what we're trying to accomplish through these brachot. So to that end, we ended last week with an observation that I think we should begin this week with. And that observation is that despite how lengthy this bracha is, and we went into some of the peculiarities of it, why do we insert an Aleph Bet poem in the middle? What are the various themes we're dealing with? We looked into some of the details last week. But one of the core themes, one of the central motifs that comes up in this bracha is this idea of underlined here. Let me get out my little fuzzy red dot. Gotta love the fuzzy dot. There we go. Uvetuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. That one of the clear core themes of this bracha is that God not only created nature, but God renews nature. And we pointed out that we know this is a core theme by virtue of the fact that it's in the pticha, it's in the opening of the bracha over here, and it's in the chatima, it's in the conclusion of the bracha. Because we see the bracha concludes, the exact same thing. So we have these two bookends, and all this in between, the poem of Kel, Baruch, Gadol Deah, all the filler, everything we say in between, that is all bookended and defined by this idea as God as the one who creates anew. And just to drive home that point, I left it off this sheet, sorry. Oh, no, I didn't leave it off this sheet, excellent. So just to drive home that point, we saw that Rav Sadia Gaon, and we'll get back to this today, this relates to our topic for today, but Rav Sadia Gaon believed that when you don't have a minyan present, you should recite an abbreviated version of this bracha, and that abbreviated version is essentially Hamer la'aretz l'darma l'brachamim u'mechadesh b'tuva b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. We see right here in Source 4 that the core of it was basically just this idea that God is the renewer of creation. So what I want to discuss today is the idea of the kedusha that we recite in the middle of the bracha of Kriyat Shema in this context, in this framing or bracketing of mechadesh b'tuva b'chol yom tamid. We, in the middle of discussing or expounding upon this idea as God as the one who creates anew, we feel the need to insert kedusha. Kadosh, 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 baruch Hashem kadosh, 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 baruch kvod Hashem imkamo. So first, we'll go into kedusha a little bit more when we get into Shemona Esrei, but I just wanted to give us the very basic context of where the kedusha comes from, because I think it'll be relevant for our discussion today. We'll go much deeper into this when we get up to Shemona Esrei. But we see in source bet that the kedusha is actually from disparate parts of Nevi'im, disparate parts of the prophets in Tanakh, and it's specifically pulled from quotes that the prophets hear by angels in their hakdashot, in their initiation into prophecy. So, there's a little bit of background. Almost all Nevi'im, at least from what we see in the later Nevi'im, have a moment of hakdasha, of induction into prophecy. And that induction into prophecy usually involves a theophany. I just use a great fancy Latin word. Theophany means a vision of God, or some sort of scene or interaction, some like an epiphany, but a theophany, some recognition or realization or vision of God. So Yeshayahu famously has a theophany in Perek 6, which leads people to ask, is Yeshayahu presented and written in order or not? It's an interesting question for Yeshayahu. But in his theophany, in his vision of God, Yeshayahu records as follows: B'shnat mod hamelech Uziyahu, when Uziyahu died, Ve're'et Hashem yoshev al kisei Ramah, Yeshayahu saw God sitting on a throne. A little anticlimactic, especially when one looks at Yechezkel. Okay, he saw God sitting on a throne. V'shulav malayim et hechal, and God's skirts of his robe filled the temple. Strange, sure. Srafim umdim yimalo. So there are fiery angels, that's what a seraph is apparently, standing on top of God. Sheish knafim la'achad, each one had 6 sets of wings. V'shtayim yecheser panav, 2 covering its face. Shtayim yecheser raglav, 2 covering its feet. V'shtayim ye'ofeth, and with 2 it would fly. Sounds a little scary. V'karaz al-zev amar, and these seraphim, these flaming angels called out, Kadosh, 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 Hashem tzavakot, Moloch ha'aretz kevodo. Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, the presence fills all the earth. So we see that the first part of Kedusha, after Nakdishach or Na'aritzach or whatever it is you say, is this verse from Yeshayahu from his theophany. Similarly, in Yechezkel, in Perek Gimel, we have the continuation of the Maisa Merkava, the vision of God, where Yeshayahu saw God in a throne. Yechezkel sees God in a chariot. Now, of course, this is very significant, actually, because why anyone want to throw out there, why does Yechezkel see God in a chariot and not in a throne? It's a hard question, so don't feel bad if no one knows the answer, but I'll give you all else time to think about it.
Maybe it's to bring back the exiles from Bavel.
Excellent, but the exact opposite. Because Yechezkel is about to preempt the exile to Bavel.
Oh, okay.
So God's in a chariot because God is signaling he's leaving Israel with them. He's not abandoning the Jewish people. But excellent, exactly. So Yeshayahu sees God in a throne. Yechezkel sees God in a chariot. And similarly, we have a very similar scene. V'yomer Eli ben Adam, it's kol dvarei asher deber elecha kach b'vavcha v'tznecha shma. God tells Yechezkel to listen to everything he's about to teach him. Alech bo el hagolah al bnei amecha v'dibart aleim v'mart aleim kol mar Hashem im yishmu v'im yechadlu. And go to the Jews who are being exiled now and tell them that God will be with them if they listen to him. But to say any ruach, a spirit carried me away. This is Yechezkel speaking. V'eshma acharai kol ra'ash gadol, and I heard a great roaring sound, presumably from the angels. I guess it's not as explicit here, but the tradition certainly reads this as from the angels. Baruch kavod Hashem kamo. Blessed is the presence of Hashem in his place. Interesting to note, by the way, that here we emphasize the makom Hashem, where we're talking about a transient or a moving God, whereas Yechezkel doesn't mention the makom, rather the exact opposite. Malech chol ha'aretz kvodo. God fills everywhere from standing and sitting in his throne, sitting in his place. So it's an interesting contrast we have there. Not a Tanakh shir though, so that'll be the extent to which we go to it. But what we do see is that Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Kvod Hashem and Kamo are clearly creeds or calling or some sort of chant that's recited by the Malachim, by the angels. Now, because of this, because they're rooted in the angels, it's not a huge leap, it's not so surprising, that over time, when these get written in the liturgy, get used in the liturgy and the Tefillah, they're used specifically for Davar Shebekdusha, for holy matters. And as we know, what's the definition of a Davar Shebekdusha? What defines holy matters in prayer and in liturgy? You need 10 men to recite them. One step further, I could say you need to stand to recite them, though there's some exceptions there, so we're not going to get too bogged down in that detail. But you need a minyan. You need 10 men to recite them. So now, given that, the question arises, before we even get into the practical question of why are we reciting these here, I think perhaps a related question that hopefully will shed some light on our why question is, what do you do if you don't have a minyan? Do you leave this section of the prayer, this section of the bracha, out? And this relates to Richard emailed me earlier in the year, because earlier in the year, I made the announcement that this was forever ago. We didn't get a minyan one Shabbat. Now, Baruch Hashem, we're getting minyans Friday night, Shabbos day. We're doing great. a while ago we didn't get a minyan on Shabbat, and I announced that we're not going to recite the Kedusha out loud during Shema because we don't have a minyan. And as we'll see, it's a lot more complicated than that. It depends on the tradition of the shul, which we'll discuss. But Richard emailed me to ask about it. And that was a great opportunity to go into the sugya a little bit. So what do you do when you don't have a minyan? So we saw already that Rav Sadia Gaon in his siddur says very clearly if you don't have a minyan, you can't recite it. You have to leave it out, skip, and you save a lot of time because you end up with a very short bracha. So very interesting. But what's even more interesting, and honestly was very surprising to me when I prepared this sugya, was that Rav Sadia Gaon is not even the earliest source on this topic. The earliest source on this topic is actually maybe Tanaitic. It's a little complicated because the origin of Masechet Sofrim is actually a very complicated question. It's a Masechet of Mishnah or of Gemara, but it's one of the smaller ones, and it might have been appended later. But nonetheless, it's Tanaitic probably, or at least earlier than the Gaonim. And it's a Mishnah, Masechet Sofrim, which also, by the way, I always think is very cool because it tells us that the exact form of our liturgy is very old. If Masechet Sofrim is talking about the Kedusha and Yotzer Or, then we've been saying Kedusha and Yotzer Or for at least 1,500 years, if not more. So that's always super cool to know, because of course we know that Anshe Knesset Hagdola solidified the Siddur, the Men of the Great Assembly solidified the liturgy, but there's tons of things that develop over time. For example, the Piyut of El Baruch Gadol Deyah certainly is of a later origin than the tradition of reciting Kedusha and Yotzer Or. So it's cool to see how old this tradition is. But we see the Mishnah Masechet Sofrim says as follows: Katan she'eno porei Shema, ein yachol lomar kadosh b'yotzer b'yachid, aval b'tzibor ona imahen. So a minor who's not allowed to be porei Shema. So this is very complicated, and we're not going to go into that sugya. But the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah actually tells us, that one of the davar shebekdusha, one of the holy matters that requires a minyan, is being pores al hashma. Literally, pores means to spread out, like pores mappa or makadesh, spreading out a napkin and saying kiddush. Pores al shma means to spread on the shema. So there's actually a big question in the poskim, and it's not fully resolved. What does that practically mean? Somehow there was some tradition that was done to do shema b'tzibor, for a communal shema. The question is, was that tradition an artifact of history from when people didn't know how to say their own shema, and nowadays we just don't need it? Or do we fulfill it nowadays through various things, through reciting Shema together in Shul, through reciting the Kedusha together? It's not very clear. So it's unclear what exactly the halachic bounds of Pares al Shema means. It's a pretty actively discussed sugya in Brachot, and it's one of those very tricky ones, because every Rishon thinks it means something different. So you got to follow throughout the Gemara. Well, Rashi reads the sugya this way, Rambam reads it that way, etc. Okay? But what we see is a katan who's not able to participate in the congregational element of Shema, whatever that is. Not going to get into that discussion. The Mishnah in Sofrim says he's not allowed, when he's davening b'yachid, when he's davening on his own, to recite the kedusha, the kiddush in Yotzer, the sanctification or the holy part of Yotzer of the first bracha. And then we see gadol, the gadol pares et Shema, yachol lomar kadosh lefi shehu bisudar. But a gadol, an adult, is allowed to recite the Yotzer, the Kedusha of Yotzer, when he's on his own. Why? Because it's in the Seder of prayer. Interesting explanation, something that hopefully will enlighten a little more. But there's some sort of appeal to the Siddur. That since it's in the Siddur, since it's part of the Seder HaTefillah, even though generally we are sensitive to whether or not there's a minyan, whether or not one's a gadol, whether or not one counts to the minyan, when we're figuring out whether one can say it, here we say, since typically an adult would be able to say it, and it's only the exceptional case where they're not praying with a minyan, it's in the siddur and they can still say it. So already this should raise a flag that we're dealing with at least an atypical davar shebekdusha, if not a davar shebekdusha at all. It's not like we say, oh, well, you can say the kedusha and Shmona Esrei on your own because it's in the siddur, right? Only certain things. It's not like we say you can say Baruch Hu on your own. It's only certain things, either a quasi status or no status at all, that would enable one to say it without a minyan. And then we say the obvious halacha of a kadosh alamida, but when it comes to the kedusha that we say in the Amida and the Shemona Esrei, since that Amida, since that kedusha, we say we will sanctify you. Eno hadin la'omra pachos mayod. You can't say it in less than a minyan. So the Mishnah Masechet Sofrim makes two distinctions. One I'm less interested in, one I'm more interested in. The one I'm less interested in is the difference between a minor and an adult. We can put that aside for now. But for our purposes, the more relevant distinction is between the Kedusha and Shema and the Kedusha and Shmona Esrei. For the Kedusha and Shema, that's bisudar, that's part of the Seder HaTefillah, and even without a minyan, you can say it. Clearly, it's not ideal, it's not like a tefillah, but you can say it. When it comes to the Kedusha and Shmona Esrei, though, that involves some sort of active element. It's not just that we're saying God is holy, but na'aritzcha. We will sanctify God. And you can't sanctify God without a minyan, so therefore you cannot say it without a minyan. So that's the position of the Masechet Sofrim. Very early, very authoritative, one would think. So it's surprising, honestly, that this is even subject to a machloket. I was very surprised to see that, given that it's halacha pshuta, it's explicit in the Masechet Sofrim that a gadol who doesn't have a minyan can say the kedusha in Yotzer Or. The closest thing I could find to maybe an explanation is that there's a Zohar that says opposite. So I have the Zohar here, and the Zohar says as follows. It's not so explicit. The Zohar says kedusha da dekamakache malache ilae. The kedusha that the angels recited, lav ihu biyachid, cannot be recited individually. V'ha'ukimna, and we establish kol kedusha de ihu b'lashon hakodesh. Any kedusha which is recited in Hebrew, yachid asar leila meimar, an individual cannot say it. Targum olam b'yachid, but if it's translated, you can say it individually. So first of all, just to explain, when we say the lashon hakodesh versus b'targum, we don't mean that if you say the words in Hebrew, it disqualifies you. We mean if you say the words in Hebrew without translating them afterwards, then you can't say it. And of course, that has to be the case because, and where do we do this? Where do we say the words of kedusha but then translate it?
In the Uval Etzion.
Exactly. In Uval Etzion, we say the words in Hebrew, kadosh, 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 and Shem Tzadok Haaretz Kodo, and then immediately afterwards we say it in Aramaic in the translation.
Isn't there an opinion? This goes back many years that the angels don't understand Aramaic or something like that.
Exactly. So the factor says, so there is, throughout Chazal, there's a consistent assumption that the angels only speak the holy language, Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew. So Aramaic is the ultimate expression of translation. Angels don't know Aramaic, so it's a clear statement that we're translating it. We're learning it like we learn Torah. And that's really the idea. We're not engaging in the act of sanctification, but rather we're learning about the sanctification, and that's why we translate it in Uval Etzion.
Or could it be that we are not only learning it, which certainly that is the reason for the translation, I would say, but that we're quoting them, and so therefore we're not really saying it's not Nikadesh, as you pointed out, it's not Nikadesh, we're saying what they say, in quotation marks.
I think that is an excellent point, and I think we're going to get back to that point soon, but Richard is really presenting, I presented we have two options. One option is when we say the Kedusha, we're sanctifying God. The other option is when we say the Kedusha, we're engaging in an intellectual activity of learning about the sanctification of God. Richard proposed maybe a middle option, certainly a third option. We're not just reciting it and sanctifying God. We're not just learning about it and theoretically engaging with this historical event of angels reciting it, but rather what we're doing is we're quoting the angels, somewhere in the middle. We're reciting it, but we're not reciting it as ourselves, we're quoting the angels. I think that's an important idea, and I'll ask you to hold on to that, because I think that's a great idea. But I will say that perhaps that's a better idea, and this is what we'll ultimately arrive at for our section, than for example, Uval Etzion. Because like Joel mentioned before, the fact we're using Aramaic or a non-Lashon HaKodesh usually means we're doing some sort of explanatory thing that's beyond the angels' recitation. Angels don't speak Aramaic, angels don't speak a translation. So perhaps there's some sort of third category, and perhaps we accomplish three different things with our three different Kedushas. So that's something we'll get back to, and it's an excellent idea.
I remember the rabbis, like for two things, for Kaddish and for Kedusha, like it was like, it wasn't explicitly said, but almost like this was, you were affecting the cosmos, and there was a big thing, like for Kedusha, you were supposed to shake even more, like literally. You were supposed to shake more. It was so holy, and you affected all sorts of different levels up there, so to speak. So, and the same thing for Kaddish. Like if you said Yehei Shmei Rabba, like with full Kabbalah, I forget what they said, but it had like earth-shattering consequences. That's the way they made it sound.
So excellent. So what Joel's mentioned here is part of my theory. So we know that the more Kabbalistically inclined or mystically inclined rabbis are really into Devarim Shebekdusha. They're really into holy matters for obvious reasons. Holiness is an essential part Kabbalah, mysticism, esoteric Judaism, etc. So perhaps because of that, the Zohar, a mystical tradition, takes Kedusha very, very seriously, and perhaps that also explains why some later authorities also followed them in a similar vein and took Kedusha very, very seriously and limited the context in which they were willing to say Kedusha. Because what we see very clearly from the Zohar is any instance where you don't translate Kedusha as a davar shebekdusha. So our bracha of Yotzer Or, where we say the Kedusha without a translation, would presumably also be a davar shebekdusha. So now one thing I'll point out is that it's not going to break down Kabbalist rabbis versus not Kabbalist rabbis. So this isn't the best explanation historically. It's merely just pointing out that different strains in the tradition will have different emphases when it comes to different things. So Kedusha gets a little more emphasized perhaps by the Kabbalists. Yeah, Jeff.
Isn't it the rule that Davar Shel Kedusha requires standing because of its solemnity? I mean, because of its importance and its Kedusha.
So,
and here in Shachrit, in the Baruch Hu, we are seated.
So that's an excellent point.
In contrast to another Kedusha that was standing.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's an excellent point, and I think that pushes us a little bit away from taking the Zohar too literally. We can't really say that this is a full-on davar shebekdusha because we don't stand. That said, I will point out that many mystics and Kabbalists and even Sfardim based in the Zohar sit during Kaddish. So it's not like a universal rule. There are some exceptions to it. But I'll point out that also in the rabbinic literature and the halachic literature, the Kedusha of Yotzer Or is often referred to as the Kedusha Demiyushav, the seated Kedusha. Yeah, exactly. So it's very interesting that it's almost characterized by sitting. And that would make a lot of sense if we're trying to emphasize that this isn't a full davar shebekdusha. So that's an excellent point. But minimally, what we can take from the Zohar is a position that, first of all, certainly is not as early as the Masechet Sofrim. We can talk about who wrote the Zohar and when and based on what, but certainly not as early as Masechet Sofrim. Somewhere between 900 to 1300, whatever the Zohar was. And also is taking some sort of almost untenably literal position. It's almost impossible to take this as literal as it's presented. There's no way any time we say it without a translation it's davar shebekdusha, because as Jeff's pointing out, there's a lot of trappings of davar shebekdusha that we don't really have with this kedusha. But minimally, we have somewhat of a spectrum of to what extent is this like a davar shebekdusha, and we have a few options of how to understand it. So unsurprisingly, that gets translated into the halacha. So for example, Rabbeinu Yonah of Gerona, in his commentary on Masechet Brachot, really it's his students' commentary on Masechet Brachot, but it's based off of his teachings. But the Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah of Masechet Brachot say as follows: Le'enyan kedusha sheberchat Yotzer Or. Also, just as a side note, I was absolutely shocked at how much literature there was about this question. It's very interesting. I think it's always interesting to think about what were the practical questions that the Rishonim had to deal with. And I imagine not having a minyan was a very common occurrence probably in medieval Rishonic time, between pogroms and inquisitions and just a generally smaller Jewish population. Probably a lot of Jewish communities found themselves without a minyan. So it's always very interesting that there's so much literature on this topic. What we see, so Le'inyan Kedusha Sheberchat Yotzer Or, with regards to Kedusha in the first bracha Shema, the Kedusha Shel Uvaletzion, the Uvaletzion Goel, and the Kedusha we say after Ashrei, Im Sarech Asara Im Lav, whether it needs a minyan or not, Nichluku Bo HaMaforshin. The commentaries, the authorities disagree. Yesh Omrim de Bechlal Davar Shebekdusha Habi. There are those who say it's included within the Davar Shebekdusha. The Ein Omrim Oto B'Pachot Me'asara, and therefore you can't say it with less than 10 people. But Omer Kishemegia L'Safa Brua Yidale Goto, and when you get up to it, you just skip. And that we saw is the position of Rav Sadia Gaon and his sitter. You just skip all of this stuff and have a much shorter davening. Aval Rabbanei Tzarfat Zal. But the French rabbis, Umixat HaGaonim, and some of the other Gaonim, Omrim Shemutar Yachid Omro, they say that it's permissible for an individual to say it without a minyan. The Lo Havi Bechlal Davar Shebekdusha, because it's not included in Davar Shebekdusha, Ela Nakdishach She'anu Makadshin Oto, Ubekiyotze She'anu Makadshin Oto. Rather, like we saw in Masechet Sofrim, the Davar Shebekdusha of Kedusha is Nakdishach, is a call to action. And for the record, this is actually very consistent, because if we think about it, what are some great examples of davar shebekdusha? Baruch Hu, call to action, bless God. Another davar shebekdusha, kriyat Torah, again, we open with Baruch Hu, a call to action, let's bless God. It seems, it could have, minimally, one could make the argument that not only inherent to Davar Shebekdusha is that it relates to holiness, but specifically it's a call to holiness. It has a call to action. Whereas just reciting the fact that God is holy, that's not a call to action. Nachtishach, let us sanctify God, that's a call to action. So an interesting idea that we see really tightly defines the parameters of what a Davar Shebekdusha should be, rooted in the Sechet Sofrim, expressed here in Rabbeinu Yonah.
Does it, when we have a minion at least, or say a minion, not just 3, for benching, does that convert the benching into something other? Of course, we do, say different. So we say Elokeinu and so on, but maybe we should stand for that if it's a Davar Shebekdusha.
So you'll note actually that a lot of people have the practice that when they say Elokeinu, when there's a minion for Zimun, they stand up for the word Elokeinu.
Well, they don't. They leave.
Yeah. So part of that is just like kavod to Hashem, but also part of it is that now that we have a minion, there's enough of us to bring God into the picture and sanctify God properly. And like you're saying, that requires standing. So it's a great observation. I always forget to do that, but when I remember, I do it because it's a nice minhag. Excellent. Okay, so now just to wrap up Rabbeinu Yonah, he says, "B'kiyutim is amru she'ein lanu lasos of pachas me'sara, aval kedusha shel yotzer she'ein lanu makansha te'olam maskira kedusha she'omrim lo mishartav mutar b'yachid." So says Rabbeinu Yonah that we're allowed to say kedusha of yotzer less than a minyan. Why? De'eno ella kemo sipor, because it's like telling over something. So just to point out, what we saw in the Sechet Sofrim was that this was bisudar. It was in the order, in the siddur, and in Rabbeinu Yonah now it's kimo sipor. Very similar, but a totally different girsa, totally different text. That it's telling over something, recounting something. So I was going to plant the seeds here, but Richard beat me to the punch. We see already this idea that Richard Bell expressed before. I have to differentiate the Richards. That it's not just that we're sanctifying God or we're learning Torah. There's a third option. We're telling over what the angels did. We're quoting the angels. And I think that's rooted in a slight girsa change, this clever little switcheroo in Rabbeinu Yonah, that we have sipor, we have telling over what the angels say. So we see that Rabbeinu Yonah lays out very nicely the two positions. There's some Gaonim, Rav Sadia Gaon, etc., who say you must skip it. There's other Gaonim and the French Rabbanim who say you say it. And that's because it's not a call to action, it's not a call to Kedusha, like Nakti Shach and Aritzach is. So, yeah, for sure.
So it seems like the way this is being developed is though this is not the main event. The main event is the Shema.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And
I already know you're going to say something great that talks to the next topic. Sorry. Yeah.
So then therefore this discussion really though is reflecting upon how do we see the commandment to and the action of saying Shema Yisrael.
Oh, very good.
Right? I mean, is that a Davar Shebekdusha that needs a minyan? Should we stand? All of that. In other words, this is, no matter how you see it, it is simply an introduction to, a very important one, to the main event, which is the affirmation of Shema Yisrael. Excellent. So that's kind of really what we're going for, which is like pardon me, a whole different kettle of fish.
You don't need to be pardoned for your love of fish, but I don't like fish myself. But nonetheless, that's an excellent point. And just to take it full circle to what we opened with, this question of Horis al Hashma,
right.
On Shema, one major opinion is that the way we accomplish it is through reciting the Kedusha in Shema. Because Horis al Shema is the Davar Shebekdusha element. It is the minyan element of Shema. And if we take this as literally, Davar Shebekdusha as literally a minyan, then an essential element of Shema, one of the ways that we're accomplishing Shema, is through reciting this Kedusha as part of the Shema. And that's a fascinating idea, because then really, we have two parallel prayers. There's the prayer of Shema, which is a Davar Shebekdusha and has a Kedusha in it. And then there's the prayer of Shemona Esrei, which is a Davar Shebekdusha and has Kedusha in it. And it's very interesting to think about why we would need two, what they accomplish differently. One is about Kabbalas Ol Malchut Shemayim, and there's a place for sanctifying God in that. And one is not about accepting God, but having already accepted God. Now, what do we say to the Melech? Amida Lifnei HaMelech, confronting God. Yeah, Jeff.
Al Siddur had the problem because we do say, if we're davening b'yachid, we say Kel Melech Ne'eman.
Ah,
We've made some, we're differentiating between a minyan and yachid.
excellent. Jeff is raising an excellent point that when we daven Shema b'yichidut, we say Kel Melech Ne'eman, the 3-word insertion, and that seems to drag us into the belief that clearly there is something special or different about davening the yachid. Now, I'll point out though that this halacha of saying Kel Melech Ne'eman is actually very controversial and debated. The reason why we say Kel Melech Ne'eman is not based in like a Gemara or based on like a very strongly founded idea. It's like a gematria thing, that the number of words in the Shema correspond to the number of limbs in our body. And if you don't repeat what's it called, Hashem Elokeinu Emet, then you're 3 words short. So instead, you should say Kel Melech Ne'eman. Because of that, the Litbox hate it. The Briskers hate it. The Rav said it's a hefsek in the middle of your Shema. You should never ever recite it. It's not worth interrupting your Shema to get some gematria points. So it's true. It definitely is a legitimate part of the tradition that some people do, but it's a later development influenced by a Kabbalistic concern for gematria. So the author of the Siddur didn't include it. So at the very least, the author of the Siddur is good. But thank you for bringing that up.
I must have missed an entire shiur, but or I certainly did. But if Shema is a davar shebekadusha, how do we say it alone at all?
Oh, so I was saying, so that's the controversial part of Shema, specifically Pores Mappa, not Pores Mappa, sorry, Pores al Hashma is the davar shebekadusha. The Gemara tells us, the Mishnah even tells us, there's an element of Shema that's a davar shebekadusha. Clearly nowadays we don't have that, and that's why the Rishonim debate so much what that means. So one theory the Rishonim put forth was back in the day when people didn't know Hebrew so well, we would recite it out loud as a davar shebekadusha together, and that's what Pores al Hashma meant. Similar
So it isn't anymore.
Exactly.
How do you take away a davar? How do you take away the kedusha from something because of a change of circumstance? That doesn't really give kedusha a lot of power.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Exactly. It's very difficult to understand. It seems, honestly, historically, not that like a historical fact necessarily matters so much for how halachic practice develops, but it seems like historically, Shema was probably much more similar to Shemona Esrei, which again, historically, wasn't a Chazarat Hashatz. It was one person said it out loud for everybody. So it seems like back in the day, people would show up to shul. One person would say Shema out loud, standing up for everybody, and then that same person would say Shemona Esrei out loud for everybody.
You know, at least emotionally, we have a moment of that at the end of Yom Kippur.
Ah, excellent. With the Shema Yisrael, exactly. We at least sustain some of that feeling of reciting Shema together. You could even say to an extent we have part of that every Shabbos when we take the Torah. Exactly, every Shabbos when we take the Torah.
Yeah, but you can't compare it to the end of Yom Kippur.
That is true. It doesn't have the same emotional oomph as Yom Kippur.
I don't know how true this is, but I read an article years ago. Apparently, the Ethiopian Jews, the one sentence they had in Hebrew was the first line of the Shema. That's the only thing they, like, after all those years that they kept in Hebrew. Everything else was in Amharic, but that was the one line in Hebrew.
That's very interesting. Well, maybe we'll cover that when we get to the Shema itself. I'm going to look into that. I've never heard of that.
Rabbi, can I interject I'll say it as fast as I can, but I think it's so related to what Joel just said, and it's such a, you know, Am Yisrael Chai. So you know that Tuvi, so friend of the rabbis, my cousin, came from, he's from birth, FFB, but his father certainly not, and his mother Avadanisht, his mother and father definitely not. But his mother became observant and learned Hebrew, and really she could lane and everything as a very senior adult. Her aunt was in a home, and the mother came from a very not religious family, secular and even some Buddhists. So she went to visit the aunt in the home, and they were chatting, and his mother said, Tuvi's grandmother, said, in chatting with her, she said, I have some difficulty sleeping. Says the aunt, who had no Jewish background, says the aunt, Ruth, I never had a problem sleeping in my life. My father gave me a mantra when I was a little girl. You already see the end of this story.
Beautiful.
And she recited Shema. She had no idea that it wasn't a mantra from the East.
That's a great story. Just to give my own Shema story, and I won't continue for time. But I remember when I was, I guess I must have been like 17 or 18. It was the summer after I met Shoshana. I was at the Met with a friend at the Alexander McQueen exhibit, and we were waiting in line. And I obviously looked extremely Jewish. And this random older man came up to me and he said, "I'm Jewish. I haven't been practicing my whole life. My father was in the Holocaust. I didn't keep any of it, but I have this necklace from him. I have this ring from him, and it has Hebrew on it. What does it say?" And of course, it said the Shema on it. And he said, "I've been wearing it my whole life because it's such a central, such a central component of Jewish faith."
Yeah.
He was very pleased when I told him what it meant and how essential it was to Judaism. But beautiful. We'll get to all of this when we get to the Shema. But for now, what we see is we have these two different opinions about whether or not we should recite the Kedusha and Yotzer without a minyan. And just as like a nice historical oddity, I mean, it's halakhically relevant as well, but it's not the most important thing, but it's a cool halakhic oddity. The Rambam actually explicitly contradicts himself across his Sfarim as to what to do. And that's always interesting because sometimes Rambam ambiguously contradicts himself. And that's awesome. That's where the briskers and the learners get really excited because then you get to explain, well, why does Rambam say this here and this there? But every once in a while, Rambam just explicitly 100% contradicts himself, and there's no way to synthesize it. There's no explanation. So this is one of those examples where Rambam just straight up contradicts himself. So he says in Hilchot Tefillah, in his Yad Chazaka, in his code of law, Seder Tefillot Kachu, we saw this a little bit earlier. This is the order of davening. V'shachar mashkim adam mevarach brachos elu. Get up and say the brachot. Koreh zmirot mevarach lefnei malachreihem. Recite the songs and bless before and after them. Koreh acher kach shema. Recite the shema mevarach lefnei achreha. Say blessing after and before shema. Umedale kedusha min habracha rishona shlefanav she'ena yachid omer kedusha. He holds like Rav Sadia Gaon that you can't say kedusha and shema without a minyan. Clearly, Rambam says it definitively, no question, no ambiguity. But when we look in the Shoot Rambam, we look at the response.
When I looked into this is exactly, of course, what I saw, and I said, "Oh, my cause is sunk."
Exactly. Yeah. When we look in the Shoot Rambam, Rambam says the exact opposite. In his response, Rambam says, "Omnam hayotzer ani roeh." With regards to the first blessing of Shema, kashem shemet paloto shatz, kach mit paloto yachid. The individual can say it just like a congregation. The Kfar Amar Zulatim and Gaonim Zal, the Gaonim already said, Zulat Zeb and it's Lubom Ram in Yachid Omer Kadosh in Al Yachid Omer Kadosh. But what about the fact that rabbis say that the Yachid can't say Davar Shem Kedusha? Rov Gaoninu Min Har Ma'arav Al Datenu Lafish Zahu Misefer Masha Omer Mamlachim Kedusha She'ena Yachid Rai LaOmra. And this is part of what the Malachim say, so it's not fit for individuals to say it. She'yakavin Hu LaHakadosh, because you're having intent to sanctify. Kmosh Amar Shleich Tzibur B'Tefillah Nafti Shachon Aritzach. But that's specifically when you're having intent. So it's specifically when you're having intent to sanctify, like when the Shliach Tzibor says, "Let us sanctify," not ritzach. Like we saw in the. It's clearly he's quoting or referencing the Masechet Sofrim from before. Interesting. Historically, he calls it the Gaonim. Maybe he's just quoting a Gaon who quoted Masechet Sofrim. Maybe Masechet Sofrim wasn't finished until the times of the Gaonim, and Rabbi was referencing that. I'm not sure. But he says very clearly, "Before Katav Zemaimar Vito Ibn Gasos," he quotes a contemporary. Ibn Gasos already said, Talmud Rabbeinu Nisim, a student of the Gaonim, B'Sifro Shechibur B'Tefillah, I believe Safek Shu Matzoy Etzlechem. And clearly, you guys have that book. So we see very definitively, Rambam says, we have from the Gaonim that you can say it, and the only time that the Gaonim said you can't say Davar Shem Kedusha is when it's like Naritzach Naftishach. In other words, Rambam definitively quotes the Masechet Sofrim. So clear stira, clear contradiction in the Rambam. And there's two ways to resolve this contradiction in the Rambam. Rasadia Ha'imni, the Taimani authority, appropriate that we're talking, I guess not appropriate. Ethiopian isn't the same as Taimani, but a very early source on the Rambam, one of the earliest authorities on the Rambam, that Rasadia Ha'imni, he says, Apaperish Rasadia Ha'imni the Rambam, so quoting Rasadia Ha'imni, Dan Bestira Zot, he dealt with this contradiction, the Amar, and he said, She'ein Lismoch HaTshuvaso, disregard the responsa, El Amasha Kata B'Chiburo, rely upon that which he wrote in his codex. Whereas the Shulchan Aruch and the Kesef Mishnah says the exact opposite. Medale Kedusha min habracha rishona, Katav Moreno Rav Yitzchak Abuhav. Rav Yitzchak Abuhav writes, Shebeno shel HaRambam, that Rav Avram, the son of the Rambam, Hayid Alaviv, testified about his father, shekata b'chtav yado b'tshuva, that he wrote in his own handwriting a responsum, sheyachid yachol la'omra, that an individual can say it. So we see that Rav Sadia Inni says, throw out the tshuva, and Rav Avram ben Rambam says, throw out the yad chazaka. So we have a machlokas here. First of all, always important to note that this is a fascinating methodological question, because this is not the only place where Rambam contradicts himself across the tshuvas and the yad chazaka. Now, of course, there's pros and cons to both of them. The Yad Chazaka was a lifelong intentional project that required much editing and much scholarship by the Rambam. And we know he was so precise because we literally have manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza, from all different types of manuscripts, where Rambam will like cross out one word and change it, or move around the arrangement of a sentence. So it's very, very clear that Rambam was extremely intentional in his Yad Chazaka. Now, on the other, sorry if it's a little loud, the people outside of the restaurant today are very rowdy. But now, on the other hand, the tshuvos, the responsum that Rambam writes, are actual responsum he gave as a halachic decisor. So that sounds also very authoritative. This wasn't just like a theoretical book. This is what Rambam told people to practice. That said, actual responsum, which there's only one copy of or one manuscript of, are much more subject to mistakes, to confusion, to forgery. So we generally are more skeptical of the tshuvot. We're also, fun fact, we're pretty skeptical about Rav Avram ben Rambam. We don't trust him as the lead authority on his father. He's definitely a good source. Like Rav Avram definitely knew his father, but there's multiple times where Rav Avram ben Rambam says stuff and later authorities just say, okay, that was Rav Avram's opinion. Other people have different explanations. So interesting historical / halachic methodological distinction here. And just to point out, this contradiction in the Rambam was unresolved throughout halacha. So much so, we don't have to see it inside, but the Meiri actually quotes the Kach Tuva Gdolei Mechabrim. The Gdolei Mechabrim, that's his nickname for the Rambam, writes this, B'tshuva Sheila, in response to a question, Af al pi sheb'ksat chibureihem k'tuva b'hefech. Even though in some of his writings, he says the opposite. So I think it's actually a little ambiguous. Does ksat chibureihem mean some of his writings? Or I actually think more likely, the Meiri always refers to the Yad Chazaka as a chibur. So I think actually what the Meiri is showing us is that Rambam had different editions of the Yad Chazaka. There's different girsas. There's different texts.
Huh.
And I think that supports the idea that Rambam actually might have changed his mind, like Rav Avram ben Rambam says. That maybe over time, first he wrote that you have to skip it, and then later in life, like his son claims, he wrote a response saying you don't have to skip it, and he went back and either crossed it out or wrote a new edition of that page, etc. Because Ksat Chibur Rehem sounds a lot to me like in some versions of the Chibur, because the Chibur always means the Yad Chazaka. So something interesting, a historical interesting fact, that the Meiri, who bases himself a lot on the Rambam, one, notes this contradiction, and two, seems to suggest some maybe historical explanation for what's going on here.
So just make sure I understand the terminology.
Yeah.
Yad Chazaka is the Mishnah Torah.
Sorry, what's the Yad Chazaka is the Mishnah Torah? Sorry, exactly.
Sure.
It's called the Yad Chazaka because there's 14 sections.
Okay,
so
fine.
Yad, exactly.
It's Mishnah Torah, and so what you're saying though is that while you would normally say that the work that he worked on over his entire life and was clearly thought of as establishing a code would be the definitive source, but there are differing editions of it that he continued to work on, which sometimes don't match.
Which is something that we know is factually true in other regards. We have historical evidence of other places in the Yad Chazaka and the Mishnah Torah where Rambam will say two different things over time, and sometimes the coolest thing, one of my rabbis in Gesher Mordechai loved to talk about when he saw the Cairo Geniza, he saw that in Rambam's handwriting, Rambam crossed out a word and wrote a different word over it, which is just like the strongest proof for the intentionality of the Rambam. Every single word was extremely intentional.
Now, this doesn't really, though, come on to what to me is our larger question of the different. It'd be one thing. Okay, so you've got a contradiction with him, but that doesn't tell us the whys. It doesn't tell us how there's a change in the attitude towards this particular thing, or my concern, the larger scope of this is part of the event of Shema Yisrael.
Excellent. Exactly. Richard is making an excellent point, and that brings us to our next point in the Shiur, that until now we've been discussing the question of whether or not one should say Kedusha B'Yachid, but we have not been discussing the question of why those stakes would exist. And that's how I want to wrap up Shiur tonight. So just before wrapping it up, I want to wrap up the halacha section, just so we're clear on the halacha, because it came up Lamaisa and Shul, and hopefully it never comes up again, because we always have a huge minyan, but who knows. So fascinatingly, the Shulchan Aruch, even though he himself wrote the Kesef Mishnah that quoted Rav Avram ben Rambam and said, ignore the tshuva, hold like Rambam in the Yad Chazaka, who says you can't say it. So he's not that definitive in his halachic work. So in his halachic work, he stakes out a middle position, and the Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh omrim shekedusha shebiyotzer yachid omra lefi she'ein ala sipur dvarim. Some say you can yachid can say it because, like Rabbi Yonah, it's sipur dvarim, it's telling over matters. V'yesh omrim sheyachid medalga ve'ein emeret ala b'tzibur. And some say you should skip it. And he doesn't take a stance; rather he compromises. V'yesh lachash l'devrayim lizaher sheyachid yomarna benigon ubetamim kekori b'torah. So if you don't have a minyan, you should still say it, but you should say it with truck. You should lane it, so worst case you have plausible deniability. I wasn't saying a davar shebekdusha, I was just reading from the Torah. So a fascinating compromise from the Shulchan Aruch. Perhaps the reason the Shulchan Aruch, the halachic decisor, doesn't make a decision in this machloket is because of this ambiguity and confusion about what did Rambam actually hold. We don't know, so he has a compromised position. That said, the Ramah adds a caveat, and this is how Ashkenazim and ultimately Stanton holds. The minhag already spread out in Ashkenazi lands to say it. The yachid omerata, and an individual can say it. And you can even say, and when you say it b'minyan, you say it out loud. So says the Ramah, no, of course you can say it. The only distinction is maybe you shouldn't say it out loud when you're b'yachid. So the Mishnah Brura ultimately paskins the Chumrah, like the Shulchan Aruch, that it would be objectively better if you lane it if you can. And that's what I try to do if I find myself be Yechidus without a minyan. I try to lane it because it's just, then everybody's happy. But if you can't lane it, you don't know how, whatever it might be, it seems that the Ramah paskins that you follow the minhag of what your place does, and we at Stanton say it even without a minyan. Maybe we shouldn't say it out loud because that might be safe for a congregation, but nonetheless we say it. But this still leads us to the question of what are the stakes? Who cares? Why is this controversial? And to that question, I want to really focus on the change in Rabbi Yonah that we see expressed lahalacha in the Shulchan Aruch. This idea is sipur dvarim. As Richard Bell put it before, I think this is really a great way to think of it, quoting the angels, telling over what the angels said. So I think we really have two fundamentally different conceptions of what we're trying to do in Shema. One understanding of Shema is that at its heart, Shema is a davar shebekdusha. Shema contributes to the sanctification of God. In other words, Shema is God focused. God is holy. We build up God. We make statements about God. And that is perhaps part of putting ourselves in the proper mindset, part of getting permission to approach God, whatever it might be. It's focused on sanctifying God. Now, on the other hand, if what we're doing is sipur dvarim ba'alma, if we're just telling over what the angels do, I think the focus of Shema and the focus of the brachot leading up to Shema is not sanctifying and building up the image of God, but rather reminding ourselves of the kingliness, of the reign and of the majesty of God. And the way we do that is we mention that God created everything. We mention that God created and gave the Torah. And, as any good king should have, we mention that God has a kingly heavenly court that praises him. And we should learn from that. We should be inspired from that, that the same God that is so kingly and divine that the angels sing his praise all day, we right now in the present should be inspired to accept his malchut, to accept his kingship. So just to wrap that up and to show how all this again ties together with the Kabbalah Ol Malchut Shemayim, I just want to share, it's a little bit of a long passage, but a powerful passage from Rav Bick in his commentary on the Siddur about this idea of the Kedusha. So Rav Bick says, and this ties into our focus before, and why is it so essential that God is mechadesh b'tuva b'chol yom tamid, that God is renewing creation? Because we see the blessing is not about creation per se, but about God's presence within creation, a presence we face daily. It's not God the creator, but God the king, the ruler who rolls the darkness away and who raises up the sun and shines it upon us every day, always. The world is the reflection of God, the garment, as it were, of God himself, through which we can perceive his presence. In other words, says Rav Bick, the reason we're praising God here is not because we're trying to praise God, we're trying to sanctify God, we're trying to build God up. is because to recognize that God is a king, specifically, we need to recognize in the moment, right now, the extent of God's divinity. The role of God as creator is not a historical claim, but rather it is a reminder to us now that God is the one with dominion over all. When you recite the Shema, when you declare his majesty, and it's not an affirmation of metaphysical truth, but a response to being in his majestic presence. The dynamism of nature reflects God's power, or his goodness, or his presence before us. And that is the experience which leads to Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim in a few minutes. That ultimately accepting God as the king is a first-hand lived experience. We have to build that feeling, inculcate it within ourselves. This explains why the angels invaded the blessing. The angels here are not angels of the Torah, who are messengers to fulfill God's will or bear his message. These angels, as they always are in rabbinic literature, are the angels of Ketubim, or of Isaiah, the hosts who are in God's presence and sing song. They are those who recite Kedusha every day, calling one to the other and saying, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar, in his commentary to the prayer, and the words, who renews in his goodness every day, always the act of creation, cites the verse, the new of each morning, great is your faithfulness, something we saw in Moda Ani earlier in the year. This is the verse on which the Midrash bases the statement that angels are created anew every day in order to recite songs of praise and are then returned to the river of fire. An angel is the direct reaction of God's presence in the moment. I wish to suggest that the sages introduced the Kedusha of the ministering angels into this blessing as an example to us of what to do, how to make ourselves ministering humans who are present before the immanent, active majesty of God. This is, in fact, the halachic rationale of why we recite the Kedusha without a minyan. Rabbeinu Yonah explains that we're not reciting Kedusha, but describing how the angels recite Kedusha, coming full circle to the Rabbeinu Yonah and the halachic justification for the metaphysical why. For the angels, God's presence is immediate, and they therefore praise and sing and recite Kedusha daily. That is the definition of their existence, and we should do the same, which is what we will do if we perceive in his goodness he renews every day, always the act of creation. So, says Rabbi, essentially, since this is contributing to Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim, this is but this is not sanctifying or praising God, but rather it's a response to the divine presence. And the response to the divine presence is song, is shira, spontaneous praise. And that is characterized by the... Just to note, this is actually a very consistent theme throughout Tanakh and throughout liturgy, that shira chadasha, the idea of a spontaneous song, is the response to divine presence. The Jews, who we know the rabbis say saw God, like Yechezkel saw God, sang at Yom Suf. They sang a shira chadasha, a spontaneous song, because song is a response to divine presence, not an intellectual effort, not an attempt of sanctification, but our own expression of feeling God's immanence. So I think what we see is that before we get to Shemona Esrei, before we get to Amida Lifnei HaMelech, standing before the king in confrontation, demanding and asking for things, we need to inculcate the feeling that God is here, God is king, and is standing before me. So that is what we accomplish over the entire Shema unit. We start with the brachot that model for us and inculcate to us the how God exactly is king. That God is the king who created nature, who has a ministering court of angels praising him, who created and authored the Torah, that leads us to Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim, to accepting God's heavenly yoke over the Shema. And then once we've accepted God's yoke, we understand that as our ruler, as our king, God has discretion over our future, as illustrated in Gal Yisrael, in the role of God the Redeemer, something we haven't gotten to yet. And that naturally leads into us now requesting more from God, confronting God, the Amida Lifnei HaMelech, and asking for more. So hopefully that clarified this very confusing part of a long, lengthy section of Tefillah. And now it ties it all together a little bit better, that we understand what we're trying to accomplish here, and we can lead into our Shema with a little more intentionality, a little more thoughtfulness, a little less randomness as we go all over the place in the first bracha. So thank you, everybody. I hope that made sense. I always love getting to share.
Very, very, very good.
Rav Bick is one of the Rebbeim I'm closest to in Yeshiva, so I'm looking forward to all of you getting to know him more. But thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.